79 years after the war ended, a metallurgical report emerged from the British National Archives that no historian had requested. It wasn't classified. It had simply been filed under the wrong code, a clerical error that kept it silent for nearly 8 decades. The document, stamped April 1944, detailed the structural failures of a tank that official records had praised as Britain's finest armoured achievement. The tank was the Cromwell Mk4, and the report revealed something the War Office had never acknowledged. It killed more of its own crews than enemy fire ever did. Between 1943 and 1945, over 4 Zeusserad Cromwell tanks rolled off British assembly lines. They were fast, maneuverable, and equipped with the powerful Rolls-Royce Meteor engine, a derivative of the Merlin aircraft engine that powered Spitfires. On paper, the Cromwell was a masterpiece of engineering. In the field, it became a coffin on tracks. The first incident occurred in June 1944, 3 weeks after D-Day. A Cromwell unit advancing through the bocage of Normandy reported that 2 of its tanks had caught fire without being hit. The crews escaped, badly burned. The official report cited mechanical failure due to field conditions. No investigation followed. 2 months later, another unit lost 4 Cromwells in a single day, all to internal fires. Again, the reports were vague. Again, no inquiry was opened. By the autumn of 1944, British tank crews had begun to refuse assignments in Cromwells. Some units painted unofficial warnings inside the turrets. Check fuel lines before ignition. Others kept fire extinguishers within arm's reach at all times. The tank had earned a nickname among the men who operated it, the Burning Cross. The families of the dead were told their sons had been killed in action. They were not told that the action had been against their own equipment. Letters sent home spoke of bravery and sacrifice. They did not mention the smell of diesel mixing with flesh, or the sound of hatches that would not open from the inside. In November 1944, a young engineer named Thomas Aldridge was assigned to inspect a destroyed Cromwell recovered from the Dutch countryside. The tank had not been hit by enemy ordnance. It had simply exploded during a routine advance. Aldridge spent 3 days examining the wreckage. What he found was a fuel system designed without redundancy, a cooling mechanism prone to rupture under sustained operation, and welds that had been completed too quickly to meet safety standards. He wrote a 12-page report and submitted it to his commanding officer. The report was never forwarded. Aldridge was reassigned to a desk job in London. He was told that his findings were inconsistent with field observations and that further inquiry would undermine morale. He kept a copy of the report in his personal files. It remained there until his death in 1998. His daughter found it among his belongings and donated it to the Imperial War Museum. It was archived but not displayed. The Cromwell continued to serve until the end of the war. It participated in the liberation of Belgium, the crossing of the Rhine, and the final push into Germany. It was praised in newsreels and commemorated in photographs. The crews who burned inside it were honored as casualties of war. The engineering failures that killed them were never mentioned in official records. Decades later, a historian researching British armoured doctrine noticed a discrepancy in casualty reports. Cromwell units reported higher rates of non-combat mechanical failure than any other British tank. The figures were buried in appendices, never analysed in the main text. When cross-referenced with crew testimonies collected in the 1970s, a pattern emerged. The Cromwell had not been defeated by German guns. It had been undone by the haste of its own creation. The war demanded speed. The factories delivered it. The crews paid for it. Now I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this story. We're interested in knowing how far these documented accounts travel and at what moments of the day or night they reach you. The Cromwell was born from desperation. In 1941, British tank doctrine was in collapse. The Crusader had proven too light. The Churchill was too slow. The Matilda, once feared in North Africa, had been outmaneuvered by German Panzer IIIs. Britain needed a tank that could match the speed of German armour while carrying enough firepower to survive engagements in open terrain. The answer was the Cromwell, a medium tank designed to combine mobility with hitting power. The design phase was completed in 14 months. Ordinarily, a new tank required 3 years of testing before mass production. The Cromwell was rushed through prototype trials and approved for full-scale manufacturing by late 1942. Engineers raised concerns about the fuel delivery system, the placement of ammunition racks near the engine compartment, and the vulnerability of the cooling system to battlefield debris. These concerns were noted and dismissed. The war would not wait for perfection. Production began at the Leyland Motors plant in Lancashire and the LMS railway workshops in Derby. Workers operated in 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week. Welds were inspected visually, not tested under stress. Quality control protocols were simplified to meet deadlines. By the spring of 1943, Cromwells were being shipped to training depots faster than crews could be trained to operate them. The tank's engine was its pride and its curse. The Rolls-Royce Meteor delivered 600 horsepower, allowing the Cromwell to reach speeds of 40 miles per hour, faster than any comparable Allied tank. But the engine generated immense heat, and the cooling system had been designed for the confined space of an aircraft, not the dusty, debris-filled environment of a battlefield. Radiators clogged, coolant lines ruptured, engine fires became routine. The fuel system compounded the problem. The Cromwell used a gravity-fed fuel delivery mechanism that relied on a series of rubber hoses running along the interior hull. Under normal conditions, the system worked. Under combat conditions, when the tank traversed rough terrain, absorbed near-miss explosions, or operated at sustained high speeds, the hoses flexed, cracked, and leaked. Diesel pooled inside the hull. A single spark from an electrical short or an overheated component could ignite it. The first documented case of a fuel-related fire occurred during trials at the Bovington camp in Dorset. A Cromwell undergoing acceleration tests caught fire after 20 minutes of sustained operation. The crew evacuated safely. The incident was recorded as an isolated mechanical anomaly. No design changes were made. By June 1944, when the Cromwell entered combat in Normandy, the tank had already killed more men in training than it had in battle. A sergeant named William Hargrave survived one such incident at a depot in southern England. He described the fire as instant and total. One moment the tank was running smoothly. The next, the interior was engulfed in flames. Hargrave escaped through the driver's hatch, with second-degree burns across his arms and face. His loader did not escape. The official cause of death was listed as training accident. Hargrave was reassigned to another Cromwell unit. He wrote to his wife, "They tell us it's the best tank in the army. The men who died yesterday would disagree." The families of those who died in training were not told the details. They received standard notifications: killed in the line of duty, honored for his service. The tanks that killed them were repaired, repainted, and sent to France. In the field, the problems intensified. Cromwell crews reported that even minor damage to the hull could compromise fuel lines. A single ricochet, a near miss from artillery, or a hard landing after traversing a ditch could rupture the system. Once ruptured, the fuel would vaporize in the engine heat and ignite within seconds. Crews had no time to react. Hatches jammed under thermal expansion, turret mechanisms locked. Men burned alive inside machines that had never been struck by enemy fire. The reports reached the War Office. They were filed under equipment performance, routine observations. No recalls were issued, no retrofits were authorized. The Cromwell was needed. The war continued. The soldiers who operated the Cromwell learned to distrust it. Veteran crews developed rituals before each mission, checking fuel lines by hand, ensuring fire extinguishers were within reach, and memorizing the fastest route to each hatch. Some crews refused to close the turret fully during operations, leaving it slightly ajar to allow quicker escape in the event of fire. This made them more vulnerable to enemy fire, but many considered it preferable to burning. Lieutenant David Tennant commanded a Cromwell during the advance through Belgium in the autumn of 1944. His diary, donated to the Imperial War Museum in 2003, contains detailed observations of the tank's behavior under field conditions. On September 14, 1944, he wrote, "Lost another tank today. No enemy contact. The fuel system failed during a river crossing. The crew managed to escape, but Henderson was badly burned. He keeps asking why the tank caught fire. I have no answer for him." The lieutenant's unit lost 6 Cromwells between August and November 1944. 3 were destroyed by German anti-tank guns. 3 burned from internal fires. The official records do not distinguish between the 2 causes. Both are listed as combat losses. The mechanical failures were not limited to fuel fires. The Cromwell's transmission, adapted from a bus chassis, was prone to failure under sustained operation. Gearboxes seized, drive shafts snapped. Crews learned to carry spare parts scavenged from destroyed tanks. Repairs were conducted in the field, often under fire, because damaged Cromwells could not be safely towed without risking catastrophic fuel ignition. In December 1944, a Cromwell unit stationed near Nijmegen reported that half of its operational tanks were running on improvised fuel systems cobbled together from parts of American M4 Shermans. The modifications violated official maintenance protocols, but they reduced the fire risk. The unit's commanding officer, Major Alan Pritchard, wrote in his after-action report, "If headquarters wishes to court-martial me for unauthorized modifications, they are welcome to do so. I will not send men into battle in tanks designed to kill them." No court-martial was issued. The report was filed without comment. If this story surprised you, make sure to leave a like to support the channel. By early 1945, the British Army had begun quietly phasing out the Cromwell in favor of the Comet, a redesigned tank that addressed many of the Cromwell's fatal flaws. The transition was never publicly announced. Cromwell units were reassigned to rear echelon duties or transferred to Allied forces. The tank's reputation as Britain's finest medium armour remained intact in official histories. The crews who survived knew otherwise. The true scope of the Cromwell's failures did not emerge until decades after the war. In 1979, a graduate student named Eleanor Marsh was researching British tank casualties for her dissertation at King's College London. She noticed an anomaly in the casualty statistics. Cromwell units reported significantly higher rates of death from burns compared to units equipped with Churchill or Sherman tanks. The difference was not marginal, it was stark. Marsh requested access to maintenance logs and after-action reports from the National Archives. Many of the documents she needed had been misfiled or remained undigitized. It took her 3 years to compile a comprehensive dataset. What she found was a pattern of systemic failure that had been obscured by wartime censorship and post-war bureaucratic inertia. Between June 1944 and May 1945, at least 340 British soldiers died in Cromwell-related fires that were not caused by enemy action. The actual number was likely higher, as many incidents were recorded only as mechanical failure without further detail. Marsh's analysis revealed that Cromwell crews were 3 times more likely to die from internal fires than crews operating any other British tank. Her dissertation was completed in 1982. It was never published in a major journal. Marsh moved on to other research. The findings remained obscure, cited occasionally in specialist military history texts, but never widely discussed. In 1998, Thomas Aldridge died. His daughter, sorting through his belongings, found the engineering report he had written in 1944. She read it and contacted the Imperial War Museum. The report was archived and eventually digitized. A researcher cross-referenced it with Marsh's dissertation in 2007. The connection was undeniable. The Cromwell had been a death trap from the beginning, and the War Office had known. Attempts to bring the issue to public attention met with resistance. Veterans organizations argued that publicizing the tank's flaws would dishonor the men who had served in them. The Ministry of Defense declined to comment, citing the age of the records and the difficulty of verifying claims from incomplete wartime documentation. Families of the dead were never officially informed. In 2011, a metallurgical analysis was conducted on a recovered Cromwell hull at the Tank Museum in Bovington. The analysis confirmed Aldridge's 1944 findings. The welds were substandard, the fuel lines were improperly shielded, and the cooling system was fundamentally inadequate for sustained combat operations. The tank had been approved for production despite failing basic safety standards. The report was published in a technical journal. It received little attention outside specialist circles. The Cromwell remains a fixture in British military museums. It is displayed alongside plaques commemorating its role in the liberation of Europe. The plaques do not mention the fires. They do not mention the crews who burned. They speak only of valor and victory. The war ended on May 8, 1945. In the factories of Lancashire and Derby, the production lines fell silent. The last Cromwell rolled off the assembly at Leyland Motors on May 3rd, 5 days before the German surrender. No ceremony marked the occasion. The workers simply clocked out and went home, unaware they had just completed the final chapter of a tank's operational life. The Cromwell was decommissioned gradually over the following years. Some tanks were transferred to Allied forces. The French received a handful, the Poles another batch. Most were driven to scrap yards across southern England, where acetylene torches cut through armor plate and reduced the machines to metal fragments. The steel was melted in furnaces and repurposed for civilian industry. Railings, cutlery, structural beams for the rebuilding effort. The tanks that had been instruments of war became the ordinary infrastructure of peace. A few examples were preserved. The Tank Museum at Bovington secured 3 Cromwells in 1946. The Imperial War Museum in London acquired one in 1950. These machines were cleaned, repaired where necessary, and placed on permanent display. Over the decades, thousands of visitors would walk past them, reading plaques that described their specifications and combat record. The plaques spoke of speed, firepower, and decisive action. They did not mention fire, they did not mention the screams. William Hargrave, the sergeant who had survived a training fire in southern England in 1944, lived until 2004. He spent 59 years after the war working as a maintenance supervisor at a manufacturing plant in Manchester. He married Eleanor Davies in 1946, 2 years after returning from the continent. They had 3 children. He rarely spoke about the war, and his family learned not to ask questions that might disturb memories he had clearly chosen to keep locked away. In his final years, when his health began to deteriorate, Hargrave was contacted by a researcher from the Imperial War Museum's Oral History Project. He agreed to be recorded, though with evident reluctance. The interview took place over 3 afternoons in his home in Stockport in the autumn of 2003. His voice on the tape is measured and careful, the words chosen with obvious deliberation. A man speaking about things he had spent 6 decades trying not to think about. "The Cromwell was a fine tank," Hargrave said, his voice steady but carrying an undertone of something unresolved. "Fast. Reliable enough most of the time. We were proud to operate it, in the way soldiers are proud of their equipment, but we all knew, even before we got to France, that something wasn't quite right. The engineering wasn't finished. You could feel it in the way the engine ran, the way the fuel system would hiccup if you pushed too hard. The officers knew. The engineers knew. The men making the tanks knew. Everyone knew." He paused for a long moment. The tape captures the sound of his breathing, the creak of his chair. "We went into battle anyway because that's what soldiers do. You don't question orders. You don't say your tank might kill you. You get in and you drive. But I never stopped thinking about the men who didn't make it out. Henderson, I mentioned him earlier, he survived the fire, but he was hospitalized for 8 months. They said he'd never work again. His hands were destroyed. I visited him once in 1945. He asked me if I knew why it happened. I told him it was a mechanical failure. I didn't tell him the truth because I didn't fully understand it myself. But I wondered every day for the rest of my life if there was something I could have done differently, some inspection I should have insisted on, some warning I should have heeded." Hargrave died on March 17, 2004, 6 months after the interview. His widow donated his personal effects to the Imperial War Museum, including letters he had received from other Cromwell crews and a handwritten journal he had kept during the war. The journal was catalogued and archived. Few people have ever read it. David Tennant, the lieutenant who commanded a Cromwell during the Belgian campaign, survived the war with a German shrapnel wound in his left shoulder that left him with permanent nerve damage. He returned to civilian life and spent 37 years working as a secondary school history teacher in Bristol. He married twice, had 4 children, and lived a quiet life that bore little outward sign of the trauma he had experienced. Tennant kept his wartime diary in a locked drawer in his study. His children were aware of its existence, but knew not to ask about it. After his death in 1997, his eldest son, Thomas Tennant Jr., found the diary and began reading through it. He was shocked by the detailed observations of mechanical failures, the names of dead soldiers, and the raw emotional content of entries written in the midst of combat operations. Thomas Jr. decided to donate the diary to the Imperial War Museum. In a letter accompanying the donation, he wrote, "My father carried this record for 52 years without sharing its contents with anyone outside his immediate experience. I believe it deserves to be preserved so that future generations understand not just the military history of the war, but the human cost of decisions made under pressure." The diary is now housed in the museum's archives, catalogued under reference number IWM 1997-45D. It has been digitized but is rarely requested by researchers. The entries about mechanical failures and crew deaths remain largely unanalyzed in the broader historical literature. Eleanor Marsh, the graduate student who first documented the statistical pattern of Cromwell-related deaths, left academia in 1985. She had spent 7 years trying to publish her findings in mainstream historical journals, only to face repeated rejection. Editors argued that the topic was too specialized, that veteran organizations would object to negative portrayals of British equipment, and that the wartime documentation was too incomplete to support firm conclusions. Frustrated by the academic gatekeeping, Marsh moved into secondary education. She taught history at a comprehensive school in Sussex for 32 years. In 2019, at the age of 74, she was interviewed by a local BBC radio station about her research. The interviewer asked her why she had abandoned her academic career. "I didn't abandon it," she said. "I was abandoned by it. The research was solid. The data was unimpeachable, but nobody wanted to hear it. The war had been won. The soldiers had been honored. to suggest that some of them had died because of engineering failures rather than enemy action. That was seen as revisionism, as an insult to their memory. But the opposite is true. Acknowledging the true causes of their deaths is the only way to genuinely honor them. She continued, "What frustrated me most was the realization that this wasn't unusual. Throughout the war, there were thousands of decisions made under pressure that had fatal consequences. Not all of them were discovered. Many were buried in classified documents that took decades to surface. The Cromwell was just one example, but it's an important one because it shows how the machinery of war, both the tanks and the bureaucracy, can obscure the truth about what actually happened to the men caught within it." Marsh's dissertation was eventually published as a book in 2008, 50 years after she completed it. The publisher was a small academic press specializing in military history. The print run was 200 copies. It was reviewed favorably in specialist journals, but never reached a mainstream audience. In 2021, a group of descendants of Cromwell crews, men who had been born decades after the war ended, initiated a petition addressed to the British Ministry of Defence. The petition requested that the government formally acknowledge the mechanical failures of the Cromwell and establish a memorial specifically honouring the soldiers who had died from internal fires rather than enemy action. The petition gathered 847 signatures, a significant number given the passage of time and the difficulty of identifying descendants of crews from a specific tank. It was presented to Parliament in June 2021. The Ministry of Defence reviewed it and issued a response in September of that year. The response stated, "The Ministry of Defence acknowledges the service and sacrifice of all personnel who operated the Cromwell tank during World War II. All casualties of war are honoured equally, regardless of the specific circumstances of their deaths. The department has reviewed available historical records and determined that comprehensive investigation of individual mechanical failures would require resources that are not currently available. We recommend that historians and veterans organizations continue their important work in documenting and preserving the memories of this era." The petition was rejected. No memorial was constructed. No official acknowledgement was made. Today, the Cromwell remains on display in museums across Britain. At the Tank Museum in Bovington, visitors can walk around a fully restored example, painted in the colours of the 15th, 19th, the King's Royal Hussars. At the Imperial War Museum in London, a Cromwell sits in the main exhibition hall, positioned alongside a German Panther and an American Sherman, allowing visitors to compare the designs and capabilities. Children climb on decommissioned models at military heritage sites. Tour guides speak of its innovations and its role in the liberation of Europe. The fuel lines that killed men are hidden beneath layers of restored paint. The welds that were completed too quickly are invisible to the naked eye. The cooling system that was inadequate for sustained combat is just another piece of historical machinery, interesting in its technical specifications, but stripped of its human consequences. The war ended, but the steel still carries the memory of what it was asked to do and what it could not bear. That memory remains embedded in the machines themselves, waiting for someone to listen carefully enough to hear it speak. Subscribe to our channel to explore more cases and curiosities from World War II. Thank you for following the story. See you in the next video.